Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight. This is our second of the series that we began last week, asking the question of whether or not there are obligatory beliefs in Judaism. So I want to just do a very quick review of what we looked at last week by introduction, and then continue specifically by delving into Rambam's Yom Karim and trying to understand his motivations and his reasoning behind the 13 that he enumerated. So we started last week by asking a number of questions with regard to dogma. We asked whether or not there are obligatory beliefs, or are we exclusively obligated in our actions? And I asked you at the beginning, if we are in fact obligated in terms of our beliefs, what are the obligatory beliefs? And are they universally accepted? And it was hard, even though Vivian appropriately mentioned the Yom Karim of Rambam, it was hard to actually enumerate all 13 of them. And that kind of reflects the fact that perhaps they're not quite as universally accepted, even if they are the most familiar of all of the enumerations of dogma. In addition to that, we asked two questions with regard to what happens if one violates a fundamental principle. So we asked, is it similar to halakha? If we violate a halakha, we're punishable. Should that also be true for our beliefs? If we deny a belief or doubt a belief, should that be punishable? And what happens if we accidentally deny them? We have a distinction between b'shogeg and b'mezid in terms of halakha. Should there be that same distinction, or is there that same distinction with regard to our beliefs? If I accidentally, let's say, take the Torah literally, and we'll talk about this specifically today with regard to Rambam's third ikar, in the belief in the incorporeality of God, if I take the Torah literally and I'm well-intended and believe that God outstretched his arm to take Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim, should I therefore, according to Rambam, if I'm in violation of this third ikar, should I therefore be punished, right? So what's this ruling? How should one conceive of a kofer b'shogeg, an accidental heretic? So we'll look at Rambam's understanding of how to approach such an individual today in his conclusion of the Yom Karim. Okay, so we asked those basic questions at the start last week, and then we looked at a number of sources so that we could kind of see the progression historically. We first looked at Bach ibn Pekudei, who argued, and this is the whole purpose of his book, Chovot HaLevavot, that all of the literature that was written in his time was all focused on Chovot HaIvarim, the obligations, the duties of the limbs, meaning external, physical halakha. What about the Chovot HaLevavot? And through a lot of investigation, he came to conclude that there are actually obligations of the inner world, as well as obligations with regard to halakha in the outer world. And then we made the distinction, or rather Martin Buber made the distinction between belief in and belief that. And belief in referred to more of the effective, trusting belief in God, versus the belief that, which is more the intellectual acceptance of certain propositions, intellectual propositions, cognitive propositions about God to be true. And we saw that in the biblical times, we looked at two different references to the word emunah in Tanakh. We saw both in B'Shalach, right after Kriyat Yam Suf, it says that Bnei Israel believed Te'aminu b'Hashem u'b'Moshe Avdo. They believed in Hashem and Moshe. They saw and experienced Hashem's salvation, and therefore they believed in him. They trusted him. It wasn't just an intellectual proposition about God, but they had this effective trust in God. And similarly, we saw the converse of that with regard to the famous hitting of the rock in Parshat Chukah. We saw there that it says that Hashem rebukes Moshe for not believing in him. Certainly, Moshe believed that God existed as one, as incorporeal, etc. But the belief, emunah, that was talked about in the biblical reference was a trust in God. He lacked the trust in God to follow Hashem's commands explicitly to talk to the rock as he was commanded, as opposed to hitting the rock, which is what he did. And we saw that in the Kuzari as well, that experience, that palpable belief in Hashem, as opposed to the intellectual belief that. But then we saw in that final reference by Rabbi Lamb, how as a result of the intellectual decline, or as a result of the fact that Hashem's presence was no longer as palpable, by the medieval times, as it had been in the biblical rabbinic times, we saw as a result of that decline, there was no more emunah shlema that was kind of experienced or universally accepted, but rather because God's presence was no longer so palpable by that time, and also with the development of humanities, rationality, philosophy was extremely prevalent by medieval times, as well as just the other cultures in which the Jews lived, the presence of Islam, the presence of Christianity, and the pressures that they endured, that the Jewish nation endured living in those lands, specifically the religious pressures, the religious coercion, and their familiarity with the tenets or the dogma of both Christianity as well as the 5 pillars of faith in Islam, that motivated rational Jewish philosophers in the Middle Ages to delineate dogma, to have their own enumeration of the tenets of Judaism so that the Jews would be able to counteract the religious coercion, the pressures of the Muslims and then of the Christians in Spain. And so we saw when we looked at that final Mishnah last time that these Jewish philosophers that enumerated dogma did not necessarily feel like they were innovating something completely new, but they just felt like they were fleshing out what was implicit, what was obligated in the Torah, both Torah Shebechtav as well as Torah Sheba'al Peh. So I'll just share my screen with you to show you that Mishnah one more time, and that'll be our starting point for today. So the Mishnah, let me just share my screen. So the Mishnah is found, that we were looking at last time, is found in Sanhedrin Perek Yud, Mishnah Aleph. And so we saw this last time. Ira, do you have a question? No, okay. I think your Zoom hand is up, but everyone should just feel very comfortable to call out and just interject as you want, especially when my screen is shared. Okay, so the Mishnah Aleph in Masechet Sanhedrin says, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek l'olam haba, shene'emar, va'anach kulam tzidikim l'olam Yeshua haaretz. And then it says, V'elu she'ein lahem chelek l'olam haba, ha'omer ein tchiat mitim min haTorah, ve'ein Torah min hashamayim, va'apikores. Okay, so everybody has a share in the world to come, except these individuals do not have a share in the world to come. One who says that the resurrection of the dead is not taught in the Torah, one who says that the Torah is not from heaven, and the apikores, which is often just translated as atheist, but perhaps has a bit more nuanced interpretation. Okay, so we see there from the Mishnah, it shows that there actually was, even if there wasn't an explicit systematized delineation of dogma, there was dogma that was implicit in Torah Shebechtav and certainly Torah Sheba'al Peh. We have these 3 kind of categories to show that these obligatory beliefs were implicit in biblical and rabbinic times, even if there was no formal list of tenets. And so, So we see that Rambam argued that these metaphysical truths about God were originally taught as part of the oral tradition, but by the medieval times, the transmission had been lost and God's presence was no longer as palpable as it had been in the earlier biblical and Talmudic times, where God had all of these wondrous miracles. And so therefore Rambam felt the need to delineate the obligatory dogma that had been understood kind of as a prerequisite in the earlier ages. So from his perspective, he wasn't innovating anything, but he was just compensating for the long period of intellectual decline. And he wanted to ensure that the people of his generation had the appropriate conceptions of God, which had been lost through the ages, in order to make sure they were able to worship God properly and defend themselves against persecutors. So Rambam believed that without the proper conception of God, and we're going to talk much more about Rambam and his understanding of this, he believed that without the proper conception of God, one could not have the proper belief in him. And so therefore he includes his Yud Gimel Ikarim, his 13 principles of faith, in his Perush HaMishnah, specifically in his commentary of the Mishnah from Sanhedrin that we just looked at. And therefore he implies, by putting it here and not elsewhere like in the Moreh Nevuchim, he implies that the Mishnah meant to teach these principles and that they are therefore part of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So let's have a look. We just did this very, very quickly last time, but let's have a look at what Rambam actually enumerates as these Yud Gimel Ikarim in the context of this Mishnah in Sanhedrin. This is just his commentary on the Mishnah. Okay, so he says our religion is based on the following 13 principles. Okay, so this is just a truncated version of a longer, he gives an explanation that we'll talk about without looking at because it's a little bit too extensive, but these are the Yud Gimel Ikarim that he enumerates as a commentary for the Mishnah that we just looked at. So our religion is based on the following 13 principles. Number one, to believe that the Creator exists. Number two, to believe that God is one. Number three, to believe that God is incorporeal, namely that God does not have a body. Number four, to believe that God is absolutely eternal, meaning no thing existed before him. Number five, to believe that only God is rightfully worshipped. Six, to believe that among men are found prophets. Seven, to believe that Moshe was the chief of all prophets. 8, to believe that the Torah came from God. 9, to believe that the Torah is authentic. 10, to believe that God knows all that men do. 11, to believe that God rewards the obedient and punishes sinners. 12, to believe that Messiah will come. 13, to believe that the dead will be resurrected. Before we get to the consequences, which he writes in the following paragraph, why do you suppose he delineated or listed these 13 and perhaps not others? Which of these do you think are really, in your mind, integral to being a Jew, and which perhaps in your conception might not be? And do you think that these 13 are universally accepted among Jews? Thoughts? Look at these 13. If you weren't already familiar with them, think about why do you suppose these were included? What do you suppose Rambam's motivation was for including these 13 and not others, right? Some would say, isn't free will a tenet of Jewish faith? How come, God's giving of humanity free will isn't included in that, right? We don't see something specifically about creation. We see you have to believe that the Creator exists, but we don't see something about specific creation, yesh me'ayin, right? So how do you understand? Any thoughts, any ideas, any reactions? Which do you think are actually in your mind when you think about what entails, the proper conceptions of a Jew, and what seems to be perhaps extraneous or maybe meritorious, but not necessarily integral? What comes to mind? Any ideas, any thoughts, any reactions that anybody wants to interject? Feel free to unmute yourself and contribute. No ideas?
I mean, so one quick thought, maybe this is like a little technical, but if he believes all of these are in the Torah, isn't number 9 the only one that's really necessary?
To believe that the Torah is authentic, and therefore, if you just believe that the Torah came from God, then that kind of subsumes everything else?
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of implies everything else, it would seem.
Okay. Responses to that? Don't be bashful. Okay. Can anybody see any kind of, if we were to categorize these, to kind of split them up into sections, does anyone see kind of commonalities between, there are a lot of later Jewish philosophers that enumerate different or kind of like have an abridged version of these 13 Ikarim. Can anyone see kind of categories or groupings that one could have? These are associated with this, and these are associated with that. Does anyone see any categories within these 13?
I see 3 categories.
What are the 3 categories?
So the first categories are around God and God's oneness and everything associated with that.
Okay.
The second is around the Torah and those who gave and who transmitted the Torah through the years. And the third relates to what I characterize broadly speaking as the end of days or the end of days.
Okay, so if you're going to say the end of days, so I would think you're implying like 1 to 5 is the first category.
1 to 5 is the first category, right?
Okay,
yes.
Relating to God, God's oneness, God's existence, different aspects of that. Okay, so starting with God's existence, ending with God is the only one rightfully worshipped. And then where would you mark the second and the third? Meaning where would be the end of the second and the beginning of the third?
Right. So the second one would start with 6, and that it would go through to 9.
Mhm.
And then the end of days or the end of days or end of life would be 10 through 13, which is, sort of around, maybe better to say, reward and punishment, and what it means sort of in the context of
Right. So those last four, and we're going to see this both when we look at the later Jewish philosophers, Shimon ben Tzemach Duran and the Rashbats, and also Yosef Albo. They both have these kind of three categories of ikarim, right? The existence of God, revelation, and reward and punishment. So they're not as specific as you suggested initially about the end of days per se, but even 10 and 11,
way of saying it, yeah.
Right, 10 and 11 kind of reflect reward and punishment, some sort of compensation, some sort of consequence of one's action. So including within, the Tchiyat HaMetim and Mashiach is also the idea of God's omniscience in 10, that God knows what you're doing, and also God's providence in 11. God is cognizant of what you're doing and rewards or punishes you, or there's consequences to one's actions as a result of God's awareness. Okay, good. So in order to better understand Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim, it's important to understand some things about Rambam. So just as kind of like a basic introduction, I want to make some things clear, especially about his Aristotelian influence, in order for us to better understand why he chose these Yud Gimel Karim and actually what he meant by these Yud Gimel Karim. So Rambam, for anybody that's not quite aware, obviously I'm sure you're already knowledgeable that he was perhaps or arguably the most profound and prolific of the medieval Jewish philosophers. He lived in 1138 to 1204, and he basically focused, because Aristotelian philosophy was so prevalent in his day, he wanted to explain how seeming contradictions between Aristotelian philosophy and the Torah could be reconciled. So Aristotelian philosophy was extremely prevalent, and there seemed, based on what Aristotelian teaching taught, there seemed to be contradictions between the Aristotelian philosophy versus what the traditional Torah conceptions were. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. The Aristotelian philosophy focused all on the intellect. Torah focused very much, as we saw from what Bachim Dukudi was saying in his day, focused very much on the maaseh, on the mitzvot. Aristotelian philosophy focused on contemplation. The contemplative life was the ideal human life. That's how one achieves human perfection. Aristotelian philosophy focused on the eternity of the world, not creation. Aristotelian philosophy focused on incorporeality of God, because anything that suggested God's corporeality or even God's emotions would limit God. It would make God finite, and it would make God changeable. And therefore, Aristotle believed that God was unchanging, was immutable. Whereas conventional Judaism taught, the Torah talks about the Zronetuyah, anthropomorphisms are all over the Tanakh. We talk about God's emotions, anthropopathisms also, attributing human emotions to God, when it says that God is a kelkana, a jealous God, v'yachar af Hashem got angry. And so we saw also all of the miracles in the Torah, Kriyat Yamsuf, Mamad Har Sinai, all of these miracles, as opposed to Aristotle's belief that everything is understood naturalistically. So there were a lot of seeming contradictions between what Jews were learning in Rambam's time in their philosophy courses and what they were being taught in traditional Judaism. And therefore, that caused the Jews in his time to feel perplexed. And they felt like either they needed to pursue the Aristotelian philosophy to the exclusion of the Torah, or they needed to pursue the Torah to the exclusion of Aristotelian philosophy. So Rambam sought out to write, especially his philosophical work, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide of the Perplexed, specifically to reconcile these seeming contradictions between what Aristotelian philosophy was teaching versus what the conventional Torah taught, in order to show his generation that you don't have to neglect one in order to pursue the others, but rather you can understand the Torah in light of Aristotelian philosophy. And so we see that is kind of an underpinning, a strong influence in much of what he writes, including what he is inferring in some of these Ikarim. In addition to that, so in addition to kind of responding or addressing the seeming contradictions or the influence or the objections as a result of the influence of Aristotelian philosophy, he also was motivated to write his philosophical works, even within his halachic works, right? His philosophical ideas like the Gimel Karim and his Perush Mishnayot, or the philosophical components of the Mishnah Torah, which is also his halachic work. he felt the need to also include this philosophy in these works for the masses in order to kind of push against or defend against the pressures by the other religions. Specifically, the pressures that Christianity and Islam were putting upon the Jews in order to convert. So this caused Rambam to write his three major works, right? The Perush HaMishnayot, which includes in it the Yud Gimel Ikarim. That's his introduction to the last parak of the Masechet Sanhedrin. And that's where he delineates, as we just saw, the Yud Gimel Ikarim. It also motivates him to write the Mishnah Torah, his halachic work, which was for the Jews in his day that couldn't necessarily understand all of the Talmud. And therefore, he wrote the Mishnah Torah as kind of a code, a halachic code for the masses, but includes within that a lot of philosophy. And then that also, obviously, as I mentioned, motivated him to write his Moreh Nebuchim. And that was specifically intended for the intellectual elite to reconcile these seeming contradictions between philosophy and Torah. And therefore, he interprets a lot of the Torah within the Moreh Nebuchim. Even though it's a philosophical work, there's a lot of biblical interpretation there in order to show how one could understand the Torah in light of philosophy, and one does not have to abandon the Torah in order to pursue philosophy. So the Yud Gimel Ikarim, we see, has a lot of these kind of Aristotelian underpinnings, and we can see why he was motivated to suggest these specific 13 in order to respond to some of the challenges or the objections in his time. We see specifically, if you look at the second one, to believe that God is one, that was understood as an effort to counteract Christianity, right? The idea that God is not multiple. And similarly, with regard to believe that Moshe is the chief of all prophets, that was to counteract Christianity and Islam's suggestion that Moshe was replaced by Jesus and then by Muhammad. So we see in his motivation of enumerating these 13 that the purpose was really to educate the ignorant among the Jews so that they would all have a universal faith and they would all be able to defend themselves against the pressures of the other dominant religions that were pushing them or forcing them to convert. And so we see with regard to these Ikarim, one needs to believe that the Creator exists. With regard to the second one, to believe that God is one. It doesn't mean that God is necessarily one as opposed to polytheism, but even the nature of his oneness is unique. The way Rambam understands God's unity is that God is non-composite. As opposed to you and I, we might be single individuals, yet composed of multiple parts. God's unity, God's non-compositeness is different than our unity. Okay. Number 3, to believe that God is incorporeal. That was a major conflict between Judaism and traditional Judaism and Aristotelian philosophy, right? Aristotle argues that it's impossible for God to be corporeal because that would make God composite, and God is non-composite, right? So it's impossible for God to be composed of physical components. Number 1, that would limit God, and number 2, that would imply multiplicity within God. The fourth one, to believe that God is absolutely internal, no thing existed before him. That also reflects the Aristotelian idea of eternity, right? So it reflects a kind of a counteraction. He doesn't go so far as to explain exclusively Yesh Me'ayin in explicit terms, but he is going against the Kadmut HaOlam. He talks about this a little bit more in the Moreh Nebuchim, where he rejects Aristotle's notion that there is an eternal universe, but rather argues that God created the world. With regard to the fifth one, again, counteracting Christianity, to believe that God is rightfully worshipped, meaning there's no intermediaries, there's no objects that one would worship even in the effort as a means towards worshiping God as an end. In the next 5, number 5, in the next 4 rather, we talked about, or Mark, you mentioned that it was the second category is the revelation or relating to the Torah and the divinity of the Torah. What Rambam means by number 5, and we'll talk about this a little bit more also, is to believe, by number 6, to believe that among men there are found prophets. Now, Rambam, again, using the Aristotelian influence, believes that one needs to develop one's intellect in order to achieve prophecy. And therefore, only an individual that has developed intellect and has an understanding of Hashem could receive the prophecy from God. And specifically, who was the chief of all the prophets? Who was the most intellectually developed? It wasn't Jesus, it wasn't Muhammad, it was Moshe, the original prophet, and he was not replaced or supplanted by others. Okay, the remaining ones in that category to believe that the Torah came from God. Again, that's mass revelation, Mamad Har Sinai, as we saw was the proof in the Kuzari, in the in Yehuda Halevi, in the belief in, and then also to believe that the Torah is authentic. Again, counteracting Christianity and the New Testament, that the Torah is immutable, it's unchangeable, it's not supplanted or replaced. And in the final 4, we see the nature of God. We see, with regard to belief that God knows all that men do, the idea of God's omniscience, again, reflecting Aristotelian philosophy that God is all-knowing and God's knowledge is unchanging. And that's how we can understand the nature of God's foreknowledge, right? That was a classic problem of theological determinism in medieval times, right? That God has perfect knowledge. God's knowledge is not like our knowledge. As our knowledge is constantly changing, as we learn more and more, God's knowledge is immutable. It's always perfect. It's always unchanging. With regard to reward and punishment, that's the classic notion of divine providence, right? That you don't have to necessarily think of that as reward or punishment in kind of provincial terms, but rather as consequences for one's actions, if you think about it from a more Aristotelian perspective. And then the last 2, the Mashiach, right? That ultimately the kingdom of will return to Israel, the nations will make peace, and then all of the nations will be subjugated to Israel, and finally Tchiat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. There's some controversy over whether or not people believed whether this was actually Rambam's opinion, Tchiat HaMetim, that the dead would be physically resurrected. As a result of that controversy, he wrote Mamar Tchiat HaMetim and affirmed his belief in the resurrection of the dead. Again, there is debate over amongst philosophers, Jewish philosophers, Rambam included, over what Tchiat HaMetim will actually entail. It's written about in some ambiguity in Tanakh. However, there was debate over whether one would be resurrected in this physical world or there would be this resurrection in a spiritual way, and whether or not one could die again after being resurrected. Okay, but what is particularly important to note is the consequences. Have a look at how Rambam understands, or what Rambam writes as the consequence to the Ikarim. He says, when a man believes in all of these fundamental principles, so this is still his commentary on the Gimel Ikarim, right? So this is just the end of his, his commentary on the Mishnah. This is just the end of his commentary on the Masechet Sanhedrin Mishnah. So he says, when a man believes in all these fundamental principles, and his faith is thus clarified, he is then part of that Israel whom we are to love, pity, and treat as God commanded, with love and fellowship. Even if a Jew should commit every possible sin out of lust or mastery by his lower nature, he will be punished for his sins, but will still have a share in the world to come. He is one of the sinners in Israel. But if a man gives up any one of these fundamental principles, he has removed himself from the Jewish community. He's an atheist, a heretic, an unbeliever who cuts among the planted. You're commanded to hate him and destroy him. So how do you understand this consequence or this conclusion of Rambam's Gimel Ikarim? How do you understand you can sin and engage in all of your most base instincts and you're considered a sinner, but you're still included in Israel? But if you give up any one of these fundamental principles, if you violate, deny, doubt any one of them, you've removed yourself from the Jewish community. You're an atheist, a heretic, an unbeliever. We're commanded to hate him and destroy him. How do you understand? Why should this be the consequence? How is this fair? How do you understand from Rambam's perspective why this would be the appropriate consequence? Thoughts? What does he mean by that? Why is it okay to sin and violate all of the halachot, but if you deny or if you doubt one of these ikarim, you're out. You're not considered part of the Jewish nation. Any ideas? How does this strike you? Any thoughts? So it seems that Rambam considers a Jew someone who holds specific dogma. And therefore, even if you deny one seemingly unintentionally, you're considered a heretic because you fail to achieve this shleimut, what it means to be a Jew. So for Rambam, human perfection is achieved when one knows as much as humanly comprehensible about God. Therefore, his 13 ikarim, well, even though they're not an exhaustive list, they're rather a necessary list from which the rest could be derived. And that leads the individual to human perfection and immortality in the spiritual, intellectual realm of Olam Haba. And therefore, he concludes that even if you mistakenly came to a wrong belief, right? Like, let's say you took the Torah literally and believed in God's outstretched arm and therefore violated the third ikar of God's corporeality. He says you don't have the intellectual perfection necessary for the afterlife. Because even if you're well-intended, if you believe that God is physical, then that would constitute avodah zarah in Rambam's eyes, and that would preclude you from Olam Haba. So from Rambam's perspective, this wasn't such a harsh punishment, but rather was just kind of a matter of fact of cause and effect. Just like you wouldn't be able to survive in a calculus class without having the proper, prerequisite knowledge of algebra, Rambam's arguing that so too you can't enter the intellectual, spiritual realm of Olam Haba without having the prerequisite intellectual preparation of knowing the dogmas of Judaism. So in order to understand this better, I want to show you Rambam's perception of human perfection. What do you suppose? How would you conceptualize? What does it mean to be perfect, to be a perfect human or to be a perfect Jew? When we strive for human perfection, what does that entail? What does it entail for you? And what do you suppose that entails for Rambam? Any thoughts? When you think of human perfection as a Jew, what does that mean to you? How do you conceive of that in your mind? Ideas?
I think applying sort of some of the approaches that we're using, it's not so much acting with perfection as it is striving for the perfection as called for in the Torah.
Great, but don't use, without using the word perfection, what are you striving for?
You're striving for closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Okay, so what does closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu mean? How does one achieve?
Apprehension, understanding, appreciation for. I'm sorry?
What was the first word you said?
Apprehension.
Apprehension. Okay, so apprehension, and what else?
Closeness, connectiveness.
But how do you conceive of closeness or connectedness? Meaning, is that purely intellectual, purely spiritual, purely inner, or is that also external?
It's both, and I think part of it goes to the dichotomy between, for example, Ahavat Hashem and Yirat Hashem, and even what Rambam talks about is the progression from Yirat to Ahava and what that actually means.
Okay, so when you think about it, what's the role of mitzvot in human perfection in your mind? You talked about apprehension. You talked about closeness.
Tools to achieve.
Tools to achieve. So therefore, means to an end, or part of the end in itself?
So that's a great question, but in this particular way of explaining it, it's a means to an end as opposed to something that has an inherent value.
So for Rambam, but what about for you?
Yeah. Oh, I didn't realize this was a session about my own beliefs.
You don't have to answer.
I happen to be very much of that, at least leaning towards that view, of not completely of that view. Yeah, I like that view. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Any comments?
But this isn't intended to be a confession in front of the 2 dozen people here.
It's not. I want to show the different. Kreskas we're going to see comes hard against Rambam. He is like totally not into this Aristotelian.
Right, and I realize that. I realize that there's a very strong view that says each of the mitzvot are inherent value in and of
100%. So
themselves,
there are no
standing
wrong
totally
answers
separately.
here, and there is no judgment here. This is all just, many would say, no, the mitzvot are what's most important. Kreskas is one of them. It's about the feelings you have towards it, and it's not just about intellectual apprehension. Here, Rambam goes so far as saying you can be the biggest sinner, you can do all of the sins, you're a sinner, but you're still part of Bnei Israel. However, if you deny one of these ikarim, you're out. So let's look at what Rambam says is the human is what constitutes human perfections. This is in the very final chapter of the Moreh Nevuchim. Okay, so in the Moreh Nevuchim, book 3, chapter 54, he goes through 4 types of human perfection. Okay, what do you suppose is the first, the lowest type of human perfection, and why do you suppose? Have a look at source number 9. He says the first, the most defective, but with a view to which the people of the earth spend their lives is the perfection of possessions, that is, of what belongs to the individual in the manner of money, garments, tools, slaves, land, and things of this kind. Between this perfection and the individual himself, there is no union whatever. There is only a certain relation, and the most of the pleasure taken in the relation is purely imaginary. For if he considers his own individual self, he will find that all this is outside his self, and that each of these possessions subsists as it is by itself. Okay, so for Rambam, the lowest form of human perfection is what we would call material perfection, amassing lots of wealth and lots of things. So it could make you great, it could make you powerful, but ultimately this is not relating to you. This is not something that you have for yourself. This is all imaginary. All of these possessions that you amass to yourself ultimately do not relate to you as a person, but these are all things ultimately you can't take with you. So this is the lowest form of material possession, even though many people strive and spend their life striving to amass this type of perfection. So let's look at the second type. What do you suppose is the second type of human perfection? Better than material perfection, but still not the ultimate type of human perfection. So he says the second species has greater connection than the first with the individual self, being the perfection of the bodily constitution and shape. Neither should this species of perfection be taken as an end, for it is a corporeal perfection and does not belong to man, but for animal. For man has this in common with the lowest animals. Moreover, even if the strength of a human individual achieved its greatest maximum, it would not attain the strength of a strong mule, and still less the strength of a lion or an elephant. The utility for the soul is absent from this species of perfection. Okay, so the second level of human perfection is perfection of physical perfection, bodily perfection, right? And so, yes, it's better than the lower form of perfection, the material perfection. Why? Because it relates to me, myself. It's not things that are just external or imaginary value, right? There is value in me being physically healthy and strong. However, it can't be the ultimate form of human perfection. Why? Because a donkey will be more perfect than me. An elephant would be more perfect than me. So yes, it's a better form of human perfection than the lowest form, than the material perfection, because it belongs to me, but it doesn't belong to me qua man, it belongs to me as part of the animal species or amongst the animals. And therefore, it's not the ultimate form of human perfection. Let's have a look at the third level of human perfection. Tell me what you think about this one. The third species, this is better than the second and the first. It's better than the material and the physical perfection. So he says the third species is a perfection that to a greater extent than the second subsists in the individual self. This is the perfection of the moral virtues. But this species of perfection is likewise a preparation for something else and not an end in itself. For all the moral habits are concerned with what occurs between a human individual and someone else. If you suppose a human individual is alone, acting on no one, you will find that all his moral virtues are in vain and without employment and unneeded, and that they do not perfect the individual in anything, for he only needs them and they again become useful to him in regard to somebody else. Okay, so the third level of human perfection, again, not the ultimate level, is moral perfection. It's better than the material perfection, and it's more perfect than the physical perfection, but it's not the ultimate form of human perfection, because I can't achieve this for myself. I can only achieve this when I have somebody to be moral, to be generous, to be compassionate towards. So what then is the final form of human perfection? And again, it reflects a strong Aristotelian influence. And this is how we understand the consequence that Rambam articulates with regard to denial of any of the Yogimli Karim. So he says the fourth species is the true human perfection. It consists of the acquisition of the rational virtues. I refer to the conception of intelligibles, which teach true opinions concerning the divine things. This is in true reality the ultimate end. This is what gives the individual true perfection, a perfection belonging to him alone, and it gives him permanent perdurance. Through it, man is man. Okay, so this ultimate form of human perfection is perfection of one's rationality, perfection of one's intellect. And what does it mean, perfection of one's intellect? It doesn't mean that you just become as smart as possible, but specifically perfection of an understanding of God, understanding of divine things, understanding of divine ways, understanding of God's creations, and thereby gaining some understanding of him. So when one achieves that type of perfection, that's the ultimate form of human perfection. Why is it better than the previous three? Because it's not something external to us. It's not something that we need to extend towards somebody else, like the third level, like the moral perfection. It's something that we can achieve as human beings that animals cannot achieve. And this, when we achieve this, this is what gives us permanent perdurance. This is how we achieve, according to Rambam and according to Aristotle, immortality. By gaining an understanding and a closeness with God, we ultimately are able to achieve a communion with God and achieve immortality. And so this is what Rambam was saying here. Why does somebody who denies one of the Yigimli Karim, why is he lost? Why is he kind of banished from being part of the nation of Israel and achieving the afterlife? Because he doesn't have the proper conceptions, the proper intellectual perfection that's necessary for this immortal life in Olam Haba. Okay, so if this is the case, Mark mentioned that ultimately human perfection, when I asked him about the mitzvot versus the intellectual, he argued that the mitzvot are just a means to an end. And this is precisely what Mark said, was precisely what Rambam says in the Moreh Nevuchim. So he says in book 3, chapter 27, this is his explanation of Ta'amei HaMitzvot, the reasons for the mitzvot. And he says here in book 3, chapter 27, that the Torah as a whole aims at two things: the welfare of the soul and the welfare of the body. So he says with regard to the welfare of the soul, it consists in the multitudes acquiring correct opinions corresponding to the respective capacity. As for the welfare of the body, it comes about by the improvement of their ways of living one with another. Know that as between these two aims, one is indubitably greater in nobility, namely the welfare of the soul. I mean the procuring of correct opinions, while the second aim, I mean the welfare of the body, is prior in nature and time. So when Rambam spends a number of prakim in the Moreh Nevuchim on Tamei Mitzvot, on the reasons for the mitzvot, and he argues that the reasons for many of the mitzvot, like lo tirtzach, lo tin'af, lo tignov, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal or kidnap. He says this is for the welfare of the body, because if we are able to live in a harmonious society, then we are able to focus on the welfare of the soul. Then we're able to focus on understanding God, contemplating God, studying God's world, and therefore coming closer to him. And so when he says that the welfare of the body, those like mishpatim, those are lower in nature, those are come prior, meaning we need to first achieve the welfare of the body. We need to first achieve what will enable us to live in a civilized society. And then we're able to focus on what's more important, on the welfare of the soul, on those mitzvot like once we've achieved the welfare of the body, once we achieve a harmonious society where everybody is living in a civilized way, then we can focus on what's really important and how we can get to that intellectual human perfection. Now, Rambam, in another chapter of the Moreh Nevuchim, talks about, or gives in chapter 51 in book 3, he writes a parable about a palace. And in the palace, in this story, in this analogy, the king is sitting, and there are lots of different groups of people at different distances from the king's throne. One's outside the palace in general. One's in the antechambers. One's in the king's actual room with the throne. And he explains that the parable reflects God, the king, sitting on his throne, while the people at varying distances reflect the different beliefs and practices of Jews. And only those individuals who have appropriate actions as well as appropriate philosophical beliefs about God only they are the ones that are able to come close to the king. And he differentiates between these different types of people in this very famous metaphor, in this very famous parable in the Moreh Nevuchim. So he says here, in book 3, chapter 51, he says, as for someone who thinks and frequently mentions God without knowledge, following a mere imagining or following a belief adopted because of his reliance on the authority of someone else, he is, to my mind, outside the habitation and far away from it, and does not in true reality mention or think about God. If, however, you have apprehended God and his acts in accordance with what is required by the intellect, you should afterwards engage in totally devoting yourself to him, endeavor to come closer to him. That is the intellect. In my opinion, it consists of setting thought to work on the first intelligible and in devoting oneself exclusively to this as far as this is within one's capacity. So it's not enough, he says, to just be like the masses. It's not enough to just kind of hearsay, understand, or just kind of like take or pay lip service just based on what someone else taught you or what tradition teaches you without thinking about it for yourself, without achieving some intellectual understanding of how to properly conceive of God. And therefore, he says that such an individual who just does the mitzvot but doesn't think about God is far away from the king's throne in the palace. And somebody who does the mitzvot and accepts propositions but without really think about it, they also haven't come into the chamber. It's only those individuals who do the mitzvot but also conceptualize God and philosophically understand and speculate, they're the ones that are able to approach God in this metaphor. And so we see here that Rambam believes that even for the masses, even those who might not be super intellectually developed, he says even these individuals have to have a basic intellectual conception about God. And that's why he includes, even though the Pirush Mishnayot and the Mishnah Torah were both written for the masses, as opposed to the Moreh Nevuchim, which was written for the intellectual elite, that's why he includes the Obligatory in his Pirush Mishnayot in order to make sure that even the masses, even those who might not be super intellectually developed or prepared, even they need to understand some basic philosophical truths about God in order to worship God properly, and in order to defend Judaism and the authenticity of Judaism against the opponents. And so we see in 2 final chapters of the Moreh Nevuchim, we see him explaining this point. In book 1, chapter 35, Rambam says, specifically with regard to the corporeality of God, he says the negation of the doctrine of the corporeality of God and the denial of his having a likeness to created things and of his being subject to affections are matters that ought to be made clear and explained to everyone according to his capacity, and ought to be inculcated in virtue of traditional authority upon children, women, stupid ones, and those of a defective natural disposition, just as they adopt the notion that God is one, that he is eternal, and that none but he should be worshipped. So even those that are not the most intellectually developed still needed to have an understanding of these philosophical truths. So when we think about what are Rambam's expectations of these Yugimali Karim by delineating them in the Pirush Mishnayot, we see that even the masses need to have some understanding philosophically of these conceptions of God. And we see this in the final source here in book 1, chapter 50. He says, know that belief is not the notion that is uttered, but the notion that is represented in the soul when it has been averred of it, that it is in fact just as it has been represented. So Rambam is saying here that it's not sufficient to just pay lip service. Like Vivian mentioned last time, when I said, are we obligated in our beliefs or just our actions? She said, well, there's the ani ma'amin that, many people say after Shachrit, ani ma'amin, b'emunah shlema, this, and this. It's not enough to just pay lip service, Rambam is saying. It's not enough to just kind of like rattle off, I believe in God, Mashiach, I believe in Sfiyat HaMetim. One needs to have an understanding, and the Arabic term that Moreh Nevuchim uses is itakad, needs to be able to have an understanding and apprehension. Itakad is translated both as belief and also as knowledge. And we see in other, Mark mentioned the Yira and the Ahava, we see in other references in the Mishnah Torah what it means to come to come close to God, what it means to know God, what it means to love God. And that is through our understanding of God, through our knowledge of God, through our learning about God. The more one knows God, the more one comes to love him, says Rambam in the Mishnah Torah. And therefore we see that it's not sufficient to just pay lip service by just affirming these 13 and then you're good to go. Rambam is arguing that one needs to have a proper conception of God in order to it be considered belief in God. And so he says that the masses were capable of, even if it's somewhat rudimentary, the masses were capable of this philosophical understanding. And that is what would prepare them for the knowledge or for the ability to subsist in the intellectual Olam Haba. So the purpose of the first 5 Bikarim, if we divide them into 3 categories, the purpose of the first 5 is to convey correct conceptual knowledge about God. And therefore it makes immortality possible for everyone and not just for those who are, most philosophically inclined. And in the second group of principles, we see that's guarantees the validity of the Torah. And we see that for human well-being in this world, through the welfare of the body, as well as the immortality in the next world through the welfare of the soul. And the final group we see with regard to reward and punishment. We see the ideas that God is cognizant and omniscient over what we do in this world. God cares and has providence over the individual. And we see that will instill obedience in the Torah. So we see these 3 groupings of Yud Gimel Karim and Rambam's expectation of what it means to believe in these 13 Ikarim, and why he had the conclusion, or why he conceived of an individual as one who must believe in these 13 Ikarim in order to be included in Klal Yisrael. Next week, we'll look at whether or not these were universally accepted. There is contemporary literature. Mark Shapiro, for instance, wrote an article that he then turned into a book talking about the limits of Orthodox theology and looking at some of the Ikarim and whether or not these are, in fact, universally accepted. So we'll look at some secondary literature. We'll look at some contemporary reflections upon Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim, and we'll also look at other Jewish philosophers who argued against Rambam's conception, number 1, of these 13 Ikarim, number 2, whether or not they were in fact obligatory in their status, and number 3, the consequences that he argued. They argue against him that there is a difference between bishogeg versus b'mezid, and if one does come to inadvertently deny or doubt one of the Ikarim, one shouldn't be held responsible or punished in the way that one is if one, outrightly, deliberately denies one of the Ikarim. So we'll look at the controversy surrounding Rambam's Yud Gimel Karim as we continue our exploration of whether or not there's obligatory beliefs in Judaism. Thank you all for coming. I hope to see you next week. Please feel free to stay on for a bit and ask questions if you need.
Thank you.
Sure.